Hi, this is Mrs. Rodriguez with the different types of numbers lesson video. All right, so today we're going to be looking at whole numbers, integers, rational numbers, absolute value, and additive inverse. So let's go ahead and get started. The first type of number we're looking at are whole numbers. So for whole numbers, they are the positive numbers with no fractions and no decimals. Okay, so it's positive numbers, but no fractions, no decimals. So some examples of that would be 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on. In fact, if you were to draw a number line, whole numbers would be all the positive numbers starting at 0 and going towards the right, with no fractions and no decimals. Okay? So, the next type of number we're looking at are integers. Let me go ahead and change colors. Integers are just like whole numbers, but they also include the negative numbers. So integers are the positive and negative whole numbers and still no fractions and no decimals. Okay. Some examples of integers. Well, we could have -3, -2, -1, 0, but then your positives as well, right? In fact, if you were looking at a number line and 0 was in the middle, right? 0 is your origin. Your integers would be all the positives and all the negatives. So it would go all the way on your right and on your left. All the positives and negatives. Just remember, there are no fractions and no decimals. Okay? Now, rational numbers. Let me go ahead and change colors. Rational numbers are any number, that can be written as a fraction. Do not let this confuse you. That does not mean fractions are the only thing that are rational numbers, okay? So let's look at some examples. Of course, a fraction can be written as a fraction, right? Because it is a fraction, so it's a rational number, right? So we have fractions, that's a given. But not only are fractions rational numbers. Remember, it's any number that can be written as a fraction. So another example of a rational number could be a whole number, like the number 5. The number 5 can be written as 5/1. Okay, so whole numbers can be written as fractions, so they're rational numbers. Okay, so here's my whole numbers. But integers can also be written as fractions. Remember, integers are just whole numbers and the negative whole numbers. So if I had a -5, I could still write it as a fraction. So it doesn't matter if it's a positive whole number or a negative whole number. They can both be written as fractions, so they're rational numbers. Okay, a third example would be a terminating decimal. So remember, a terminating decimal is a decimal that ends. So let's say we have 0.25. That's a terminating decimal because it ends at the 5. There's no numbers after that. Okay, and this is a rational number because we can change that to 25 over 100, right? Because that 5's in the hundredths place. And I could simplify that to 1/4. So it can definitely be written as a fraction. It can be written as 25 over 100, and then I can even simplify that fraction to 1/4. So terminating decimals are rational numbers, okay? Another type of rational numbers are repeating decimals. Now, repeating decimals are when the decimal doesn't terminate, but there's a pattern that repeats. So an example of that would be 0.333, and it just keeps going, right? Well, that can also be written as 1/3. So that's definitely a rational number. Okay, so the most important concept to remember is rational numbers are any number that can be written as a fraction, but that doesn't mean it has to be a fraction. Okay, it could be a fraction like your 3/4, but it could be a whole number or an integer, because we can write those in fraction form by sticking a 1 under them. Terminating decimals and repeating decimals can also be written as fractions. So they're rational numbers as well. Okay, now the next type is absolute value. So let me go ahead and change colors. Absolute value is the distance of a number from 0. Okay, and it's always positive. So let's take a look at an example. If I have a number line and here's my 0, which by the way is called our origin. Okay, and I want to know what the absolute value is of -5. Okay, the absolute value. That means it is the distance between 0 and -5. How many spaces there are between the two. So if I were to look at my number line, there's going to be -1, -2, -3, and -4. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spaces between 0 and -5. So the distance is 5. Okay, and we write absolute value by using these bars. Okay, so it would look like this. Those bars mean absolute value. The 2 lines mean absolute value. Okay, and in this case, the absolute value would equal +5, because there's 5 spaces between the origin, your 0, and -5. So the absolute value of -5 equals 5. Now, you might be wondering, why is it always positive? Well, distance, there's no such thing as a negative, right? If I told you I was going to drive from Auburn to Sacramento, I wouldn't say it's 30 miles away. Or I'm sorry, I wouldn't say it's a -30 miles away. I would tell you it's just 30 miles away, because distance doesn't have a positive or a negative, right? If I was going to drive from here, Auburn, California to Reno, Nevada, I wouldn't say, oh yeah, it's -80 miles away. You would always just say the number, which would be 80 miles away. So it's the same thing for absolute value, because it is the distance. You need to keep that in mind. It is the distance. Okay, it's not how much is that number worth. It's the distance of that number from the origin, which is 0. So in this case, it is 5 spaces away. So the absolute value is 5. Okay, another example, let me just draw a little line here. Another example is if we had the absolute value of, let's say, +5. Okay, so here's my brackets for absolute value. And what would that equal? Well, if I drew another number line and here's my 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I put 5 spaces on the number line, we have to remember that it's the distance from the origin, which is 0, to that number. It's how many spaces, what the distance is between the two. So if I was going to count those out, it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 5 spaces between the origin 0 and the number 5. So that means the absolute value of positive 5 is 5. Okay? Now, for the last one, it's the additive inverse. Okay, so the additive inverse is, let me switch colors again. Let's see, I'll do orange. The additive inverse, let me draw a line just so you don't get confused. The additive inverse is the same number but it has opposite signs. Okay, that's the additive inverse. So what do I mean? All right, let's look at an example. So if it says, what is the additive inverse of -4? Well, it's the same, it's the same number, right? Same number, but opposite sign. So that means the absolute value of -4 would equal +4. Okay, another example, oopsie, sorry about that. Another example would be the additive inverse of +3. Same number, right? Same number, but opposite sign. So the additive inverse of 3, same number, so we know it's going to be a 3, but it's going to be the opposite sign. And the opposite of a positive is a negative. So it's going to be, oopsie, my pen wasn't working. It's going to be -3. So those are the types of numbers we're learning today. Additive inverse, the opposite number, or I'm sorry, the same number but opposite sign. The absolute value, which is the distance from the origin or distance from 0. Rational number, any number that can be written as a fraction. Integers, that's your positive and negative numbers, but no fractions or decimals. And whole numbers, all your positive numbers without fractions and decimals, and without decimals. Okay, and as always, if you still need help or if you have any questions, feel free to come see me during office hours. Bye.